Welcome everyone to the first episode of IGNITE's Conversations. My name is Xuanming, and together with Ilva, Gustavo, and Neo, my co-founders of IGNITE, who are here as well, we thank you for joining us today. In this 3-episode series, we have invited guests from various organizations in the Olympic and Paralympic movement to provide their insights and to discuss how the current pandemic and postponement of the Tokyo 2020 Games has impacted their professional and organizational plans. We hope that these sharings will contribute to the pooling of knowledge, the ideas and best practices that we can all learn from. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Melina Xanthopoulou, Senior Director for Competition Planning and Director of Sport for the Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games, as well as Andrew Baker, the Vice President, International Relations and Public Affairs of the Canadian Olympic Committee. Melina brings to the table more than 25 years of experience in the field of elite sport events, encompassing World Championships, East Asian Games, 6 Summer and 2 Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games, as well as the Youth Olympic Games. Melina has also worked extensively as a consultant for the International Olympic Committee. No stranger to practicing sport, she was a table tennis player in the Greek national team and a basketball player in the Pierce College team. Andrew is a 15-year veteran of the Olympic world, a vital member of the Canadian Olympic Committee since 2005, having participated in 6 Olympic Games, 4 Pan American Games, and 3 Youth Olympic Games. During this time, he oversaw significant expansion of the level of support provided by the COC to athletes and sport federations, as well as leading the planning and delivery for Canadian delegations. Amongst his many tasks, he is responsible for leading the COC's efforts to bring the Olympic Games back to Canada, and still finds time to mentor and nurture that next generation of sport leaders. As an athlete, he competed in athletics, soccer, and volleyball, and these days he is trying to perfect his handstand walks and aims to run an 18:30 5 km race. And to give all of us some context, many of us would be content to run 5 km in 30 minutes. So Andrew, wow. Friends, if you wish to pose any questions to our speakers, do feel free to type them into the chat and we will endeavor to address them at the end of the session. Jumping right in, what were your thoughts when COVID-19 became a worldwide pandemic? Andrew, could you lead us in?
Sure, thanks Ming, and thanks for the introduction. Really happy to be here today, and congratulations to you and to all the co-founders on the founding of IGNITE. We're excited to see the work that you do. For us, it's been a little bit of a long road, I would say. Actually, starting in February, it started to have a little bit of an impact on our business as we were evaluating our final site visit to Tokyo. And we were actually running a 10-year anniversary event for the Vancouver 2010 Games in Vancouver towards the end of February, followed immediately by a site visit to Tokyo. And both of those events were starting to be evaluated in the context of COVID and its impact on Canada and around the world. So the event itself, because it was still early days in Canada, we were able to still run this gala that brought together hundreds of people and a public celebration. And we really didn't have a major impact there. But the site visit to Tokyo, because of what was going on worldwide and because of the travel risks, we did start to scale our site visit to Tokyo. So that was the first impact we saw on our business, was when we were reducing the number of people who were attending that site visit in Rio, which was the last week of February. I personally was evaluating whether or not to take a trip to visit family in Singapore. And so that for me was something I had booked and was looking forward to, and was really going back and forth as to whether or not I would take that trip. In the end, I did, and it was probably 1 week. It was exactly the week I could have. If it had been 1 week later, I would not have been able to do that. While I was on that vacation, while our team was in Tokyo, the organization met on that Friday and decided that we would restrict all non-essential travel for staff moving forward. And so that was the first major impact that it had on our business. As of the end of February, we had restricted all staff travel to only what was deemed essential. So essentially, we grounded all of our staff upon return from Tokyo and anyone who was remaining. And that was really, I think, the first time that it really hit home. So everyone at that point in time was evaluating the fact that they would no longer be able to travel to meetings that they were meant to take. They could no longer participate in certain events that were scheduled. And so that, I would say, was really the first time that we saw it would have a major impact on our business. But even at that point, I would say that we didn't anticipate it would have the scale of the impact that it has had.
Thank you, Andrew. And what about for you, Melina?
Well, living in Asia, I think for me, the realization that things are quite serious came a little bit early. When we start seeing the restrictions from China at the very beginning of January, I think the rest of the world at that time was thinking that this is an Asian virus and it's not going to affect much. But as soon as January passed by and we saw all these restrictions happening that we're not allowing certain areas and athletes to participate in qualifying events, that was the first impact we had. Because obviously there were some restrictions on athletes participating into badminton qualifications. Then we knew that the athletes from North Korea were restricted in participating. We already knew that Chinese athletes were spread around the world to try to save themselves from the virus, and they were training in other areas. So the first qualification issues start popping out in mid of January, end of January. Then in February, funny questions coming from the IOC and the international federations were the ones that start triggering me that, okay, we're into something more serious here. As qualification events start being canceled, and for some of them being moved to next year, which was quite, big surprise for us, like the World Championships indoor in athletics. Then as we were moving on, more and more qualifications were being canceled, and a big question mark start floating on when are these events going to happen and how we're going to allocate these slots and quotas. And then towards the beginning of March, I think that's where the whole world started realizing that this is not an Asian virus. This is going to go around the world and very fast. And qualification events in Europe start being canceled, having a huge effect on the whole qualification system. Because up until then, the situation was still a little bit manageable. But after these events start being canceled, the numbers were becoming really very big to catch up with only at the end of May and June. And after that, I think it was first couple of weeks of March that we were bombarded with questions from all entities involved with and clients involved with the games that they really truly believe that the future is that there's going to be a postponement. And we start looking at solutions behind the scenes, obviously, of what the day after could be and how this is going to be managed. So yes, it was a slow process, and it was a painful process, I would say, for all of us involved, because decisions were not being made. We really didn't know what's the way forward, and motivation was going, with everything that was going around us, motivation was down to zero almost.
Thank you, Melina, for sharing those insights. I think many of us here as well within the chat will remember where we were when we first heard that COVID-19 was now a worldwide pandemic, what with the upwelling of emotions and the concerns that we had, the changes and disruptions that are practical, personal, but also out of our hands on a larger scale, such as what both of you have mentioned. Andrew, NOC Canada spearheaded a really strong stance regarding participation at Tokyo 2020. We understand that this decision was founded not only on responsibility towards the athletes, but also to the public at large. Could you speak to us on the steps and thought processes that led to this decision, and what triggered the entire decision in the first place?
Sure. Yeah, and obviously it was a very difficult decision to make, and one that gained a lot of attention, probably more than we would have liked, to be honest. But as I was talking about, we had started to see the impact in towards the end of February. And I would say as an organization, we seem to be a little bit ahead of the curve on most of the decisions we were making. We restricted all of our staff travel before most organizations in Canada anyways had done so. We started to have our staff work from home a little while before most organizations in Canada had done so. So we seem to be just trending ahead of the curve. As a senior leadership team, we had started to come together daily and in some cases multiple times daily at the beginning of March. And we were, as we reviewed the process and the impact of COVID on our business. And so we were into a very regular routine of discussing, almost being in crisis management mode from a very early point in time. And I think everyone would have seen this. Things changed so fast. And so it was almost like for a few weeks, for us anyways, every day we would wake up and there would be a new reality that we were dealing with. And so you always seem to be adjusting on the fly to information that would come out, whether it be domestic information that they had shut down all gyms and all training centers, or international information around events being canceled or new spread or what it was. So there was a lot of information that we were just managing and trying to react in the best way possible. So the decision and the announcement that we made was made on March 22nd that Canada didn't feel like they would be able to send a team to the Olympic Games if they happened this summer. That was, ironically, that happened on a Sunday night. We had a feeling like we were in crisis mode for so long before that. On Friday, our CEO had said to the senior leadership team, let's all try to disconnect this weekend. We'll talk on Monday, and this is going to be a long haul, so let's try to get some rest. And then, of course, we woke up on Saturday morning, and as had been happening, there was new information. There were several countries who had outwardly called for postponements. We were hearing lots of feedback from our sport community, from our athlete community, and we had seen the situation in Canada continue to get worse. And so on that weekend, we did call a senior leadership team meeting for the Saturday afternoon. We came together to start to discuss. We brought our board of directors together that Saturday evening, all virtually, of course, and started to have discussions about what was the Canadian Olympic Committee's position, where were we at the time, was it safe for our athletes to be training? And really what was coming out was that as long as there was the potential to have the Olympic Games that summer, that it would compel our athletes to try and find ways to train, which could have a negative impact on their health and was putting them at risk. And as we continued to have the conversation coming out of our board of directors meeting, we called a meeting of our athletes commission on the Sunday morning. We were meeting with them, and there was a strong sense that they felt that they wanted to be champions for the greater cause of public health in Canada, and that they could redeploy their time and energy to helping spread the message of having people stay home and become champions for that public health message. It also became clear that if they were compelled to train, they were not only putting themselves at risk, but their families and their communities by being in spots that they weren't. And the public health messaging was getting more and more direct. It was stay home, do not leave, and do not congregate with groups of people. And so there was a whole confluence of factors that were really making it very clear for us that it would become increasingly difficult for our teams to properly train and compete at the games. And we recognized that it wasn't so much a discussion about whether or not the situation would be better in July. It was very much of what is the situation now, and we were feeling that our athletes and the communities were at risk in that moment. And so when the IOC statement came out on the Sunday morning, or the Sunday afternoon, I guess it would be, with the fact that there would be 4 weeks to make a decision, we understood the complexities of that decision. It's very understandable that those types of decisions would take a long time. So we really tried to focus on what we could control, and that was the Canadian delegation at the Games. And really the only way that we could give certainty to our athletes to have them stand down from training and to reduce the risk to their health was to say that we wouldn't be competing. that this summer, and that they could focus their efforts elsewhere, and they could stop training for games this summer. And so we had that conversation with our athlete community, with our sport community, all of our sport leaders, our CEOs, high performance directors. We went back to our board, and it became very clear that that was the stance that our community wished to take, and that there was support for that. It wasn't an easy decision. It was heartbreaking for many people, but they felt it was the right thing to do. And it was based on the right principles. And so the decision was made and released on that Sunday. And that all happened very, very quickly, probably quicker than we would have liked, but it was felt that we needed to give immediate certainty at that point in time. And so it was the whole decision-making process happened extremely fast over the course of the Sunday, and was reacting to information that was coming at us over the course of the weekend. So I think with everyone, things just were changing on a daily and an hourly basis, and that's where we landed on the Sunday evening.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you were incredibly intentional about actively gathering information in advance and taking preemptive action, and that allowed you to stay ahead of the curve. And also with regards to being incredibly respectful, not only of your athletes, but to the community at large. You spoke about several bodies that you were in touch with in all your discussions. So the Athletes Commission, for example. Was there a lot of contact also with the governmental authorities in Canada throughout the entire process of discussions?
Yeah, so we, when we were going through this process, I should mention, we had our chief medical officer who sat on every one of our calls with our senior leadership team. So every morning would be giving us updates and would be providing us the reality. He was also linked into the chief medical officers of all of the national institutes and training centers. And he was linking into epidemiology experts in Canada and other healthcare professionals. So he was providing us with a well-rounded source of information relative to the health situation of both athletes and the communities across Canada. And so that became a very important source for us. He was, as it related to the government officials, we have very strong relationships with the Sport Canada, the sport body. And we had them on most of our community calls. So when we were engaging with our high performance directors and our team leaders, they would sit in on those calls, and our CEO was in contact with their Director General of Sport Canada, equally as Own the Podium, and some of our other key sport partners. And so we did have a significant number of stakeholder consultations throughout the whole process, including government. Although it is important to state that it was not a government decision, it was a Canadian Olympic Committee decision. It wasn't backed necessarily by government, but they were supportive of the process that we went through. So there was a divide between the government stance and the Canadian Olympic Committee stance, but ultimately they were a supportive partners of ours through the process.
Thank you, Andrew, for giving us that insight, and especially into your decision-making process, and also sharing how quickly things were changing. We know, of course, that this pandemic has really far-reaching consequences in the health sector, socially, economically. So, Melina, could you perhaps give us some insight into how this has impacted your plans and activities from the perspective of an organizing committee?
To be honest, if we want to go into an OCOC perspective, the list is so long, we could probably spend the rest of the meeting just on that. And there is a lot of uncertainty right now, not only among the staff, but I think also in upper management, because this is obviously an unprecedented situation that nobody has ever faced before. We don't have any guidelines, as we usually do with games. You know, there's no technical manual to follow on. Every single day, it's a new thing for us. So from an OCOC perspective, obviously the number one thing is budget. The impact on the budget, as you all realize and you know, it's quite significant. And I think this is the number one priority right now. And then the second priority, I think, it's securing the venues, both non-competition and competition venues for the same time next year. Obviously, I mean, I'm sure that you all know that the village was supposed to be turned over to the private sector at the end of this year after some renovation that was going to happen further to the conclusion of the Paralympic Games. this is not going to happen, or they are trying to renegotiate everything right now. It's a huge impact. We still don't know how this is going to go forward. And then also to go ahead and renegotiate all the venues. A good number of venues were rented or taken over for a specific time from various entities and municipalities, private sector like clubs, for example, for golf. So all these are going to be renegotiated right now with each one of the owners. And then you have so many, every single functional area has to look through the impact of this postponement. I can tell you the ones that I'm facing as sports entries the last couple of weeks as we're moving forward. Staffing is one very important one. I'd say that motivation, it's a very big one. People have made their plans, and people, everything has changed for them very, very suddenly. And everybody's trying to see, where are we positioned in this? Some people had signed contracts with another job right after this, but they still don't. They feel a commitment in these games as well. So what do they have to give up? How do we move forward? Of course, yes, we're going to be very busy for about a month, but after that, no, there's going to be a huge gap. We know that there isn't going to be much to do for a very big amount of time. How do we keep ourselves busy? Are we going to renegotiate our contracts? What exactly is going to happen? People don't really know. And this is not only entries, this is across the majority of the functional areas. And then you have our headquarters. You might have read today at the various sites that we're searching to see what's going to happen with our offices, because obviously we were going to turn them on back to the owners, I think, end of September. And we were going to stay in one building for those of you that have visited Harumi. But now we're into searching new headquarters where everybody's going to move, or we're also looking into ticketing and the effect that it's going to have on people, because we already see on various websites here in Japan, people trying to sell their tickets for next year because they're not going to be in the country anymore. There were a lot of expats who bought the tickets for this summer, and now they cannot participate in that as spectators in the games. Hotels is another huge area. Canadian Olympic Committee is one of these clients that they have booked outside of the village a very big number of rooms through various agents, and this is all need to be renegotiated for next year. Training sites, it's a huge impact across everything, and I think the organizing committee is trying to put everything into the right perspective as soon as possible. We're aiming for the next 20 days. We're all working hard to look into our operational plans, see how we're going to adjust it, look into our staffing needs and how we can adjust that, give the opportunity maybe to some staff members to be a little bit more flexible, by taking maybe more vacation or unpaid leave, or we're looking into every possible option to make this thing work. So yes, the impact is absolutely huge.
Goodness, Melina, this is massive. It sounds completely overwhelming undertaking that lies ahead of you. But I'm sure together with the leadership and together with all the experience that is on the team, everyone will pull together. What about for the COC, Andrew? Melina was just sharing one of the impacts that would affect you.
Yeah, and I think similar. I mean, all of the different organizing committee projects, many of them would have an NOC component and an NOC impact, and so very similar to Tokyo 2020, we've been going through our various project streams to identify the impact. And as part of over the course of this process, we have a partnership with Deloitte, and we brought in one of their risk management experts to support us in how we track our project impacts and our risk impacts. So we've developed a large risk impacts spreadsheet that is tracking all of the various project impacts. And similar to the organizing committee, that's a very long spreadsheet with many lines of data that identify the various project impacts. Obviously, the games planning for Tokyo is significantly impacted, and all of the various details are very very much up in the air, but we're trying to work through them. It really has a significant impact on our planning for Beijing as well. And so that very quickly became part of the focus, is how do we plan for 2 games that are now 6 months apart. And so we've taken a step back and looked at all of our staffing plans and how we structure our staff, and we will overhaul our staff structures to be able to deliver those 2 games, and we will change the roles and responsibilities for certain people to allow for a focus on Beijing while Tokyo is happening. There's an impact on our marketing partnerships, and so we have a huge number of marketing partners who are great as supporters and have been very supportive of us through this process. But this obviously has impacts on their agreements for 2020 and beyond, so we're working through the impact of that. We were really at the final stages of a campaign, working with or lobbying our government essentially for additional funding, and that the budget for Canada was meant to pass in March, and it obviously hasn't happened. And so that campaign, which was kind of 6 to 8 months in the making, has been deferred. And so there's a whole body of work around our government relations that we're asking ourselves, how can we now flip the script a little bit and become partners with our government for helping support public health messaging. I mean, our work on future bids, that's obviously impacted as well. It requires interactions with the various levels of government who are obviously predisposed to other things at the moment. Our Canadian Olympic funds, our family funds are obviously impacted. So really, if you look across the business, I'd say almost none, there's no area of the business that isn't impacted by this. It might be to various degrees, but there's just such a broad range of impact. But one thing I would say is that very quickly, and I'm really proud of our staff on this, very quickly there was a mentality shift about what are the opportunities that this brings. And so as much as we were going through very early on the impacts and the risks and what this meant for us in that regard, we did also very quickly get to a point where people were looking at what are the opportunities for the organization? What does this mean we can do differently? What does it give us more time to do? And how can we adjust our operations to be better? And so that at the same time is something that we haven't lost track of, is this actually does create a whole host of opportunities for us to do things differently and do things better. And as much as there are challenges, there are opportunities in this as well. And so we're trying to focus also on those.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a hopeful note to end on for all the impacts that we are seeing with regards to COVID-19. Just coming back to you, Melina, to go into more detail on this point, you and your teams are, of course, no stranger to the challenges of fast turnover and the changes that happen as a part of your work. Can you share with us the complexities that this postponement has generated for sports entries and qualifications? And you touched a bit on this earlier. What are the new measures that you now need to build into this as you look ahead? What concerns do you anticipate? And how would you say this differs to the complexities that you faced, for example, for Rio 2016? Because obviously both of these were difficult and unprecedented situations. And to give everyone who's listening in a little bit of background, Rio 2016, of course, following the investigations into the allegations of systematic doping, this created huge impact as well for sport entries and qualifications.
Well, I'd say that there are 2 very difficult situations, but very different at the same time. Rio 2016, the situation with Russia was something that we were anticipating. And I have to be very honest, I was not anticipating that the games could be postponed in my lifetime. But for the Russian case, it was something we were anticipating as things were moving forward, and we were preparing ourselves for it. And the impact was strictly on mainly the sports entries department and a little bit on communication and maybe a village allotment. But when it comes to this situation that we're facing this year, the impact is so much broader. And obviously, for doping, we did have some guidelines in place, and we did follow those guidelines to a certain degree. But for what is happening right now, everything has to be reinvented from scratch. We've never had such a massive amount of qualification events being canceled. We've never had the principles of the games ever being revised during an Olympic period. It's the first time that the principles for qualification have been revised. I was part of the working group that did this revision. Actually, it was done twice, because at the very beginning we started working on the version for cancellation of events only, and the actual Olympic Games still happening in July. And then the second version of revision happened just some days later, when we actually had the postponement. So for us, the impact is huge on entries. First of all, about 43% of the athletes have not yet qualified. About 57% of the qualification has been concluded. The rest of the numbers, they all had to go through either rankings or qualification events, and some of them were nominal, some of them were slot. We've done massive exercise in cooperation with IOC to identify all the canceled events and possible other ways of reallocating quota. We've met with all the IFs to go through different scenarios for the future. The problem is that no one really knows when the wheel is going to start rolling again. So we really don't know when this virus is going to be over, and it's going to stop affecting a very big part of the world that it is right now. So we really don't know when the events can be staged with certainty. We do have some plans, but we really don't know if these plans can be overruled by life itself and what this virus wants to do. The sports entries team is working constantly on trying to identify all these gaps that we're having from now on until next April, I would say, where the whole circle of, again, accreditation deadline, pre-DRMs, DRMs, and final going through to the games. I think there are going to be a lot of challenges with every IF to establish the way forward for these upcoming months. It's going to be a difficult job to verify the exact events and how the quota is going to be allocated, since we really don't know when the events are going to start happening again. The new provision and the new principles that the IOC has provided are much more flexible than the previous ones. I'm sure Andrew is already aware of what these principles are including. So these principles have been communicated already to all the IFs. It gives them a lot more flexibility. They can extend their qualification period. It gives them flexibility to change age limitations that we had in the previous qualification systems. It gives them the flexibility to, at the a very, very last resort, if they really have to, change a slot into a nominal qualification. So it does put a work frame to allow them to be as innovative as possible in order to move forward to conclude the qualification for these games. But as I said, the impact on sports entries is quite significant, and but the team is coping really well, and we're very close, and we're working very close with our international federations. I believe at the end everything is going to be a success.
Thank you, Melina. So one last question to both of you before we look at some questions from our audience. Looking to the future, our world has changed greatly, to put it mildly, since the first Olympic and Paralympic Games. Even from 2010 until now, just within the space of 10 years, the advent of technology has vastly modified our processes and the delivery of the Games. Melina, you know this really well. You were spearheading quite a few of these changes. The changing climate also has impacted the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games. And now we have COVID-19 and all the uncertainties that this brings. How will our world change, and how will our worldview change? For both of you, how do you think that sports and the sporting world will be further affected? Both of you have watched and worked within this dynamism and the evolution of the sporting world. How do you anticipate it might influence the sporting world in the future? Maybe let's begin with Andrew.
Sure. It's a very deep question, Ming, for 8:30 in the morning on Thursday. But I do think that, I mean, we'd seen it, as you were mentioning, there's been a ton of changes in the world over the last 10 years and in the last couple years. And again, I'm going to look at the opportunity, and with some hope is that maybe this situation will reverse some of the negative trends that we've seen, the rise of populism and all that. I think what we're really seeing is there's a major focus on social isolation and health and community and care. And what I'm seeing is that when we talk, there's a lot of talk about mental health, and there's a lot of talk about the way that physical activity ties into mental health. And I'm hopeful that this becomes an opportunity for sport in general and fitness to become part of the forefront and how we recover from this as a both country, communities, and as a global community. So I'm hopeful that this will be an opportunity for sport to become a really valuable tool in recovery for the world as it comes out of this crisis. I think that equally applies to the Olympic Games as a chance to show that we're back and that the world is coming together. I do think it will be done differently. I think there will definitely be different health and hygiene standards at various venues and gyms across the world from here on out. I don't think any of us will ever go back to how we were as it related to being comfortable with things that, you know, touching different things and picking up weights and doing this and realizing that those things aren't clean that often. So I do think that the health and hygiene standards of different venues and sporting events will change, but a lot more hand sanitizer moving forward, I would guess. But I do think that I do think that really positioning sport and positioning physical activity as the backbone of communities across the country and as the backbone of both social interaction, physical wellness, mental wellness, is an opportunity for the sport world to really come back to the forefront and to remind people of how much value there is in sport and in physical activity. And so, I mean, I'm very passionate about the impact that the Olympics can have in communities and in encouraging people to be physically active and the values and the benefits that brings. So I'm very hopeful that that this crisis on the other end will come out with a stronger sport system and with a stronger position for sport globally.
Thank you, Melina.
I agree with almost everything that Andrea said, but I think I'm a little bit more, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but I think that the day after is going to see this world in a huge recession. We have to be honest about this. And it's going to be a global recession, with the majority of the countries who are leading this world being at the verge of almost bankruptcy. So the world is going to be a different world as we know it on the day after. I know that people haven't felt yet the impact of this recession, but it's going to be a reality for the majority of us. And in that respect, as much as I would love to see, you know, sport being part of recovery, I think the people are going to focus on fitness, but I'm not sure of how much you're going to focus on competitive sport. Fitness, yes, and physical activity is going to be a very big part because it's also, you know, a very big part of staying healthy. But in terms of competitive sport, I think it's not going to be a priority in the world. And given the fact that, you know, there's going to be a recession, I think the budgets are going to be extremely, extremely tight for any staging of events from now on, and at least for some years to come. In that term, I strongly believe that we need to find solutions to maximize results with minimum resources possible, whatever that means. It means maximize, you know, if we have to minimize resources if it comes to staff, minimize resources when it comes to the type of venues we're looking for, the type of technology we're offering, the type of services we're offering. I think all these things have to be reviewed for the next years because the world is going to give you priority. I think health is going to be one of the things that everybody's going to invest on: medical facilities, better healthcare systems, investment in research. So I'm not very optimistic in terms of how things are going to move forward, at least for the next 5 to 8 years. Of course, there's going to be a recovery, and of course, sport is going to unite again and thrive again. But for the time being, I say things to be a little bit tough. In terms of the Olympic Games, I feel that next year, if things go the way we're all hoping to go, it's going to be a huge celebration. It's really going to bring the world together. We're all going to celebrate, humanity winning the gold medal, most probably, because we're going to really overcome this very, very difficult time that we all went through. It means, to me personally, it means a lot. It's going to be a symbolism of survival and how we learn to adjust with everything new, how we find inner strength to cope with things that we never imagined we can cope with. So, yes, my view is that at the very end, sport will be the winner, but it's going to take a while from now on.
Thank you very much, both of you. To be incredibly respectful of us, of both of your time and everyone's time, I think we'll just look at a few questions from our audience and look to close this session. I apologize in advance. We will not be able to answer all the questions that were in the chat during this time, but we will try to get to them at a later stage and come back to you who are in the audience outside of this session. For Andrew, from Andrea Macquarie, she sent her congratulations to the COC for your decision and showing leadership. She would like to know about the risk of your decision, specifically in terms of the participation of Canada at the Games in case the IOC did not postpone the Games. What were your considerations as far as risk?
Sure, that was obviously the worst case scenario for us, would be that we had made the decision not to go and that the Games continued. And so it was certainly a risk that we evaluated and one we evaluated very seriously. And that was what made it such a difficult decision, is that there was uncertainty around whether or not the Games would in fact be moved. And so it wasn't a decision that any of us took lightly. And there were many times over the course of that Sunday when we were evaluating where our stance was landing, that we realized, we had these moments of realization that was the case and that was the risk. We were somewhat, I wouldn't say confident that the Games were moved, but it was, even day to day, it was seeming increasingly likely that would be the end result, that the Games would be moved. And so we were hopeful, and in the letter we wrote to the IOC and in the release that we made, we were encouraging them and urging them to make that decision as quickly as possible, to provide certainty globally. But again, we were really focused on in that moment, it was about more than just sport and about our athletes competing at the Games, and it was about the health and safety of those athletes and their families and their communities, and how we could have them become part of the solution from a public health perspective. And so we very quickly came back to the health and safety component for Canadians and how our athletes could become part of that solution.
Thank you, Andrew. A question from, and I apologize if I'm mangling your name, Marcus Magalese, Games Coordinator from the COC. He says that, Andrew, I was very proud of the COC when the news was shared that they wouldn't be sending the athletes. It was a difficult decision, of course. And his question is, Melina and Andrew, although we're working through this pandemic, what changes in the Olympic world do you both believe to see happening for future Games in response to this unprecedented event? So beyond what you've already shared, but I suppose more specifically with regards to future Games?
Well, in terms of organizing the Games, I believe strongly that a lot of things are going to change. And I think one of the major things is traveling, which is a huge cost. We all know now that you don't need to be on site to do your job. So, and you don't need to be on site to do a coordination commission, I think, and you don't need to be on site to have a project review. And there are so many other solutions that can save you tons of money as we're moving forward. And the same goes for the NOCs. And, I'm not sure if all these NOC visits are really needed, and we can find different ways of doing those. If you can, instead of a team of 12, if you can bring only a team of 2 or 3 who are going to train the people later on, there's a lot of room, I think, for savings at that place. Another one is level of services. I think we're going to redefine the level of services. Some of the things were nice to have, and we all know that, and we might have to not go with them anymore, and really focus on what's really needed for an athlete to perform and nothing else. Technology is also another area that we can that can save us a lot of resources if we use it wisely. And of course, if we use new tools and new ideas as we move forward. So I think, yes, we're going to see a lot of changes when it comes to budget savings. And if you compare this with the Agenda 2020 and what the IOC was trying to do for the future, combine it with the lessons learned from what happened, not only to the organizing committee, but what happened to the world. I was, just as an example, I was reading an article today of how many companies around the world are deciding not to go back to their headquarters. There is no need to pay for big offices anymore. They realized that they can shrink themselves into one big meeting room and have everybody working from home. And so there is a lot of things. So who knows? We might not need headquarters that have capacity to host 4,000 people working under the same roof. There's so many ways we can save, and I think we're going to be very innovative and look into it in detail and come up with new ideas for the future games.
Thanks, Melina. One last question from Anna Maria Garcevic, Head of Activities, Olympic Games Promotion at International Olympic Committee. Andrew, what immediate opportunities for your NOC can you see at this moment as a consequence of the whole situation? Anna Maria is also curious about what kind of support is offered by the NOC to the athletes during this crisis.
Sure. So on the first question on the opportunities, we did go through an exercise, and I think Celine, who's on the phone, ran a great meeting at one point a few weeks ago where each of our functional area leads listed what they viewed as their opportunities out of this crisis. So we had been talking about so much of the challenges, but really led a session where it was everyone had to define one of the opportunities for their area. But a couple that jumped to mind. One is the opportunity to test different staffing models. So we will, for the first time, test really distinct teams and certain teams that maybe some of our staff do not go to Tokyo and stay completely focused on Beijing. And so that will be a new way of working. And so we'll test, it will give us the ability to test certain things with regards to staffing. We as an organization have also undergone on our game side significant changes in staff adjustments, whether new people coming into the business or people into different roles. And so this gives them an extra year to get settled into their roles, to learn the business, to learn the games world, and before we actually have to deliver. So there's some opportunity there. And then I think there were certain projects that we were feeling we were a little bit behind on for Tokyo, certain things that we were trying to implement that we were just behind the 8 ball a little bit. And so this now gives us the opportunity to take a step back and accelerate those. Outside of the games delivery, I think there's also some opportunities for us to build really real relationships with our different levels of government as it relates to their them viewing sport as a partner in both providing public health messaging and also as a recovery tool. And so I think we're seeing as part of our, we launched the We Are All Team Canada campaign around the same time that we were making the decision not to attend the games. We viewed it as, again, very quickly focusing on what we can do to support the public health messaging, and the We Are All Team Canada campaign launched that evening or the day after. And so we saw some of our governments pick that up and start to refer to it. So using, again, our platforms to support the public health message and build those relationships with governments is another opportunity. Related to support for athletes, I would say it's athletes and national federations is a major challenge. So many of our national federations are also hugely impacted by this because they are being forced to cancel events that were revenue drivers for them. And so Skate Canada, for instance, was meant to host the World Championships in Montreal, which were canceled, and that was meant to leave revenue and legacy funds that were going to fund different high performance programming for them. So there's a massive impact across the system, both domestic championships and international events that were meant to be hosted. We are working closely with Sport Canada, our government partners, to identify what different support programs our athletes and our federations have access to. The Canadian government has launched a number of different programs to support lost revenues for organizations that are being impacted by this crisis. There are EI employment insurance benefits available for different staff. So we're helping our athletes navigate the different government programming. We are looking as well at our funding programs to identify what we might be able to do. We have athlete excellence funds that are rewards for results, and so we're analyzing how we maintain those programs in the absence of different events that are happening. But our government carding system, which the government of Canada provides funding to high performance athletes, that has not changed. That those programs remain, so that source of revenue for our athletes has not changed. But we are trying to do more because it is a major impact for both our sport federations and our athletes. Challenging.
Thank you. We do actually have a few more very interesting questions, but as mentioned, we will follow up with you after this session. I guess to close, Andrew and Melina, would you like to share any messages of hope with our audience?
Of course. I mean, life wouldn't be, of course, we're very, very hopeful. I mean, despite of all this discussion, we're still super excited about the games. I'm really very dedicated to make the Japanese people proud next year. I think it was a huge blow to their pride of what happened this year. They're really trying to cope with it. I feel that the games next year are going to be a celebration. And through what happened, we're all going to find best practices for the future, maybe, adjusting to better ways of delivering games in a different way from what we're used to. We need to learn to think out of the box. That's this situation is one very good example of how to think out of the box. And I think that's something for everyone to take as a lesson. We cannot afford anymore to say that's the way we did it. It's how we should do it in the future.
Thank you, Melina. Andrew?
Yeah, I think I've been fairly optimistic throughout the conversation, but I will say, I think what this does reinforce for me is for all of us, this is such an amazing international community. I think just even being on this call and seeing all the familiar names is inspiring, and it just brings such great energy. So thank you to you and the team for bringing us together. And I think we are. This is getting a bit overused, but we are all going through such similar things. We're all really navigating this together. And so I think the more that we can reach out and we hear stories internationally about different groups that are really dealing with the same issues, it gives us hope and makes us realize that we're part of something so much bigger. So I really do think it is such a privilege for me and for all of us to be part of something that will bring such a positive impact on the world down the road when it all comes back together. So thank you to you guys for bringing us together. Thanks to Molina, to you and all the work that Tokyo 2020 is doing, and those around the world that are working on bringing this back together and bringing this all together once this crisis is over.
Well, to close, everyone, today Andrew and Melina have shared with us their wisdom and the best practices that existed in their practices prior to this pandemic, and that we know will extend beyond the pandemic. There is a massive task ahead of coordination and teamwork, which calls on all of us to engage in universal skills such as leadership abilities, whether it's our self-leadership within our teams, our self-awareness, recognition of overload and fatigue, our limitations, also our tolerance for adversity and uncertainty. They have also shared with us their vision and action, whether it's the readiness and the bravery to tackle challenging topics and times, and to make sound decisions that are based on facts and responsibility, setting the appropriate tone, managing our task sequence so that we can enforce clear expectation of what is being done, who is doing it, and to provide certainty and therefore keep ahead of the curve, and to therefore anticipate any problems that might arise and basically avoid those problems in advance. They have also highlighted very strongly that we are not alone in what we do, and our ability to cooperate is absolutely paramount to our success. All of these are linked to our normal practices, but in these times of duress, it will challenge our competence, our strategies, and our adaptability. Really, thank you once again to Andrew and Melina for your time and for sharing your experience and wisdom with us. We will share Andrew and Melina's Twitter handles and Instagram handle on the chat. And of course, do follow @Team Canada. You may follow us, Ignites, on social media platforms as well, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and do also visit our YouTube channel. You will be able to see a recording of this session there in the coming days. During these challenging times, please do take time for each other and for yourselves. Reach out to friends and loved ones and build resilience in our connections with each other. Physical distancing, of course, does not mean the loss of connections, but rather this reframing of them. And I think the message that Andrew and Melina have also shared, try to take a step back from the chaos of thoughts and information and feelings of grief to catch a breath and recall our strengths, our determinations, and our intentions. We can look at what is present, what is practical, and what is possible, and allow hope to permeate and punctuate our days. And of course, keep calm and wash your hands. Until next week, everyone. See you next week.